New York, I'm Chris Hayes. Hundreds of armed demonstrators faced off with the federal government in southern Nevada over the weekend, and the federal government blinked. Just another reminder that whether or not the law is enforced depends on who you are and whether or not you have the right-wing media on your side.
Battle of big government versus the rancher.
It's big government versus the rancher, and Mr. Bundy is not backing down.
When push comes to shove, when it comes to the Constitution, folks aren't going to back down.
I'll be honest, we saw what happened at Waco and the Branch Davidians. I'm concerned.
Right now, the biggest story in the right-wing media is the face-off between federal agents and this man, Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy.
America better wake up if we're going to live in this country with any kind of freedom and liberty.
Mr. Bundy owns around 500 head of cattle. They've grazed on this plot of land in southern Nevada for decades. But Bundy doesn't own that land. The federal government does. And in order to graze cattle on federal land, managed by the Bureau of Land Management, you have to pay land use fees. Bundy stopped paying those fees in 1993. He now owes the government over $1 million. You see, Bundy doesn't think the federal government owns the land. In fact, he doesn't recognize the federal government at all.
I abide by all of Nevada state laws, but I don't recognize the United States government as even existing.
The courts disagree with Mr. Bundy's reading of the Constitution and have ordered him to pay for his use of the land like every other rancher does. Last year, a federal district court ruled that the BLM was entitled to seize and remove Bundy's cattle.
He owes the American people $1 million because he has not obeyed the laws.
Earlier this month, the BLM started rounding up some of Bundy's cattle that illegally graze on federal lands.
No BLM! No BLM!
On Wednesday, a confrontation between Bundy family members and supporters and federal rangers went viral.
Comply! Comply!
The feds say officers were assaulted and a police dog was kicked, while Bundy family members allege they were thrown to the ground and also tased.
We have always said that we will do whatever it takes. We've never defined that. And I think that's one of the reasons they're here with such force, is they're scared of us.
Within days, Bundy became a symbol of the fight against an out-of-control federal government.
We need guns to protect ourselves from a tyrannical government.
Hundreds of states' rights protesters flocked to Bunkerville, Nevada to support Bundy. Many of them armed.
I'm willing to lay my life down.
The group shut down several lanes of a Nevada interstate and engaged in tense negotiations with federal law enforcement.
Protesters flooded this federal holding pen area aiming to release Cliven Bundy's cattle.
Push him back up off the gate for right now. Let me work with you and you. I'll allow you two to come in with me. That's it.
It's the people or not, and you guys need to leave.
Push these people back so they can do it safely.
Federal officers tried to bring the Bundys over the line to negotiate.
I'll give you my honest word right here. I'm going to walk you in so you can negotiate with your father up top.
Walking past armed BLM rangers, the Bundys started talks about releasing the cattle and calming the crowds.
But what I need you to do is to keep this crowd calm, above and below.
After a days-long standoff with federal authorities, Cliven Bundy won the day.
I only want to talk to one person in each county across the United States. And here's what I want to say. County Sheriff, disarm U.S. bureaucracy.
This weekend, the BLM started to release Bundy's cattle and suspended their operation, citing safety concerns. In the meantime, Bundy has been elevated to hero status by Republican politicians.
Out in Nevada today, federal agents are pointing rifles at American citizens in an escalation of a standoff over a man who for 20 years has grazed his cattle on some land that the state owns.
For 2 decades, Cliven Bundy has gotten something for nothing. He's been in open violation of the law and owes the federal government over $1 million. If all of that were true of someone else, conservatives will be calling him a freeloader. Joining me now, Eric Boehlert, Senior Fellow at Media Matters. Eric, this story seemed to me to come out of nowhere and just blew up in the conservative media.
Republican in the White House, this would have gotten 5 minutes from the right-wing media, because when the Democrats in the White House, suddenly the federal government takes on tyrannical powers and things like this. So look, they're always in search of the outrage. It's the outrage industry, and he declared a range war. The federal government made it known that they were going to come and take his cattle, and then Sean Hannity and Drudge. It's a very small group, and they all are in the same spin cycle, and everyone loved it.
I mean, but
there was no questions asked. They just
right. That's the thing, is that look, if you of all the people to make your cost, I mean, you just look at the fact. I mean, the guy says he doesn't acknowledge the existence of the federal government.
Right.
He has not been paying for the land that his cows are using. I mean, this is the same conservative media that's always talking about takers, about moochers, about freeloaders, about when it comes time to immigration, they say the law is the law. You can't just countenance people breaking the law. People have to be held accountable for breaking the law. The guy is manifestly breaking the law.
And he's not a part of a larger movement. He is not in terms of any sort of rights movement. He's one guy who doesn't want to pay.
Who doesn't want to pay for his cows to eat grass on federal land.
And the hypocrisy is so wide-ranging. So Obama, one of the central arguments about Obama, the right-wing media, lawless, refuses to acknowledge the Constitution, is above the law. Occupy Wall Street. What was the #1 complaint from Sean Hannity and Limbaugh? They're breaking the law. They won't listen to the cops and things like that. So, the law and order is supposed to be a bedrock principle, but they're always trolling for this Obama angle, and so they'll upend, what's supposed to be a bedrock principle, law and order.
Well, you talk about Obama angle, but what struck me about this is this really seemed like 1990s vintage. Again, I think that the Bureau of Land Management played this correctly in backing down. Is there a dangerous precedent that basically says the law does not get enforced if you can get several hundred people bearing guns to show up and stand in the way of the federal officials who would enforce that law?
But it wasn't just those 100 people. It was the echo machine. It was the right-wing noise machine. And it was the combination of those two that has now set this precedent. And if this precedent were flipped and it was liberal activists or immigration activists, they'd be crying foul.
Are we on the other side of that hypocrisy, though? Would we be celebrating if it was someone, it was a war tax resistor, if it was someone who is sort of trying to stay in a foreclosed home, right? I mean, don't we all just kind of want the law? We want the law to be broken symbolically when it's the law we don't like.
Yeah, but again, I think we go back to this instance. If someone was staying in a foreclosed home, they would be representing a larger movement, of plight. This is one guy who said to the federal government, I'm not sending you checks anymore.
And let me also say this about Cliven Bundy: the guy's doing quite well for himself. I mean, this is not a downtrodden individual. We should be clear, right? This is not someone whose family is starving, who is in dire straits because he has to pay the grazing rights. He actually runs a very successful ranch.
And he's got a very good publicist.
Eric Boehlert from Media Matters, thank you so much. Joining me now, Nevada political journalist John Ralston, host of Ralston Reports, editor of the Ralston Flash. John, this is the biggest story in the conservative media nationally, but I also get the sense it is a huge story in Nevada.
Well, it's a big story here now, Chris, because of all those people that came down from out of state, and you and Eric laid it out very well. I mean, this completely got out of hand and was twisted into something that it wasn't. Cliven Bundy is not a hero. He's not a victim here. He's a guy who essentially has gotten away with breaking the law for 20 years, and while I think you're right, the BLM had to stand down at the end, they botched this at the beginning. They set up these idiotic First Amendment zones for the protesters, and they helped make Bundy into this hero. It spun out of control, so all these militia types and the Oath Keepers come from all around, and they had a situation they could not control. I'm glad they stood down, because you go in an errant shot, a kid could have gotten killed, you don't know what would have happened. But the biggest story here to me, here in Nevada, Chris, is these Republican politicians trying to get mileage out of this, going back to the Sagebrush Rebellion, which, by the way, was settled in court here in 1979.
This has become a Harry Reid as the face of tyrannical government.
Yeah, and he is being blamed for this, and he is a great boogeyman, of course, here in Nevada. But that solar plant is planned down near Laughlin, which is nowhere near that. But they've come up with all kinds of things they want it for fracking. But let's forget all that for a second. The issue here is very simple. This is not his land. It has never been his land. And now you think of what he's saying today, Chris. He's saying we want county sheriffs to disarm federal agents of the law. There are still people out there, these militia types, the Oath Keepers. There's a Republican assemblywoman by the name of Michelle Fiore who's whipping this up, referring to the government and doing what irresponsible legislators always do, choosing for the lowest common denominator, the Nazi analogy. So that's still going on even today in this state, Chris.